Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about missing records. If you are new to family history, you may not be aware that there are quite a few really important genealogical records that have gone missing over time due to fires, floods, tornadoes, wars, poor record keeping, whatever the case may be. And so what we're going to cover today are some of the big record collections that some of you might be looking to use and that some of you who are new to family history might not yet know are missing. So we'll cover those. And then we'll talk, for those of you who've been around a little bit longer and have been looking for records that might be a little bit more obscure, we'll talk about how to discover if the records that you're looking for are missing records or what the circumstances are. Now, there's a difference between missing records and records online. I just want to make that really clear right up front. Not all records are available online. Only a small fraction of the existing genealogical records that we need to use are available online. Now, of course, millions of records are coming online every day, but that still means that there are millions and billions of records in courthouses, in archives, in libraries, in record repositories all over the world that have to be accessed and can only be accessed through those record repositories. So what I'm talking about specifically is records that should be sitting in an archive or were sitting in an archive or a library or a courthouse at one time, but then because of fires, floods, tornadoes, wars, whatever kind of natural or man-made destruction circumstances, those records no longer exist. So with that introduction, let's go ahead and dive in and talk first about some of these larger record collections that those of you who are brand new to family history might not yet be aware are actually missing records. Let's start with the 1890 U.S. Federal Census. If you're new to family history, you probably have figured out that the United States takes a federal census of everybody living in the country every 10 years on the tens. That started in 1790. So the first federal census was taken in 1790, 1800, 1810, so on, every 10 years, right up to today. There is a 72-year privacy law attached to the U.S. Federal Census. That means that the most recently available census for the public is 1940. The 1950 census will not be made available until 2022, which sounds like a really long way away when I say it out loud, but when you look at the math, it's not really all that far away. The exception, of course, to this is the 1890 U.S. Federal Census. There was a fire where those records were kept. And then, of course, we use water to put out fires. And so between fire and smoke and water, those records were pretty damaged and eventually destroyed. Now, there are some fragments of that 1890 U.S. Federal Census that still exist. In some cases, certain states or certain areas of certain states kept copies of the census and then sent the originals, of course, onto the Census Bureau. And so there are some copies that still exist. And so you can actually come into Ancestry.com, go down to the card catalog, which is under the search button, and you can type in 1890 into the card catalog, and you can see, if I filter here by census, and if I can filter down further by U.S. if I want, but you can see there are some pieces of the census still remaining. So we have the 1890 veteran schedules, and then some states have what are called compiled census or census substitute indexes. So you can see those. And then right here we have what is the 1890 United States Federal Census fragment. And before you even search it with the search box here, you can actually come over here and see which fragments exist. So just a very few states, and then you can see if the county in your state was preserved and if the township, okay? So you see here, in the state of New York, for example, we only have 2 counties that have remaining records. in those counties, in this particular county, there's only one township that had a remaining record and only one enumeration district. So when we say fragments, we mean fragments. But if you happen to be lucky enough to have family who lived in one of those fragments, one of those remaining areas, then that's fantastic. So don't discount it entirely, but recognize that the majority of that census is missing, and we lament it every day. Now, there are ways around it. I'm not going to go too much into that right now. That giant gap between the 1880 census and the 1900 census, there are other records you can use to fill in the gap. And if you go to the Ancestry YouTube channel, you'll find I did an entire video on getting around the missing 1890 federal census, where I give some tips and tricks for how to use other kinds of records to fill in the gap of that particular set of missing records. The next set of missing records that most of you should be aware of, and if you're brand new to genealogy, this may be news to you, are the U.S. military service records, particularly for the Army, though other branches of the military were affected, and specifically those for soldiers who served in World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. So in the 1970s in St. Louis at the Personnel Records Office, again, there was a fire. And that particular fire destroyed 80% of the military service records for men who served during those, men and women who served during those particular conflicts. And so that's why we get this question every day. People say, well, why can't I find my grandfather's military records on your website? Well, it's because we don't have them. Now, with that said, there are still, 20% of those records that are still in existence. And the National Archives has undertaken a project by which they are attempting to recreate the military service records for those that were destroyed. And so they're collecting information about service of men, whether they get that service record from a state, whether they get it from a courthouse, whether they get it from a private family, wherever those records are coming from, they've spent years trying to collect and recreate those records. But because the recreation of those service records can come in any form or format, and because they are still actively collecting those, most of those records have not been digitized. So if you want access, or if you want to see if your family member has a military service record that either survived the fire or that has been recreated, you can contact the National Archives. On their website, they have a request for military information form that you can fill out, and you can request whatever information they have about the military service for your particular family member. So there are ways around this, even though that is a tragic loss of records. There are some ways around those missing records. Now, I didn't put U.S. on here because England also suffered a huge loss of World War I military service records. They actually call the remaining records the burned documents because even the records that survived, some of them are burned or have damage around the edges. Those particular records, Ancestry has actually digitized in conjunction with the National Archives of England. So again, if I come in here to the card catalog, I can filter this card catalog by military, and you'll see that the very top thing that comes up here in the list then is the British Army World War I service records from 1914 to 1920. Again, keep in mind, these are not complete because they were damaged. If you scroll down to the database description, you'll actually see some information about these burnt documents. You'll see some information about what survives and what doesn't survive. In particular, approximately 5 million men served in the British Army during World War I, and this this database contains all of the records that are left. They estimate that about 60% of them were destroyed. So 6.5 million records were destroyed, and this is what we have left. So You could do a search or a browse, either one, to get to the set of records that you're interested in this particular collection. And when you pull them up, just again be aware that even the documents that still exist, some of them have some damage. And so, this is actually a really clean one, but, just a few smudges and stuff. But some of them are actually charred, or entire parts of the pages are missing. And, what you get is what you get with these collections. We're just thrilled that what survives still survives. So those are two of the basic record collections that a lot of people getting into family history need to be aware of that are missing. There are other missing records. Here's one that some of you who even have been involved in family history for a while might not be aware of. In the earlier years of the Us Federal Census, there are in some states where the entire state the census for an entire state in the U.S. Federal Census records is missing. And so the easiest way to determine if your state was included or not, again, is to pull up that specific collection. So if we look at 1810, for example, if I go to that specific database, I can then see here which states were included in that particular census. And so you'll notice not all states are listed here. For example, Georgia is missing entirely in 1810. So just because a state was a state, or even if you're not aware of, when it became a state, all of that plays into whether or not they were included in the federal census. But even if they were a state, when the census was taken, they may not have been included because there are some records that are missing. And so I always just check the browse box really quickly before I search. Okay, this browse box serves as kind of a little bit of an index to just let me know if the records that I'm looking for exist or not. And then, I'm not wasting my time searching for a family in Georgia or for a family in, Tennessee or Kentucky or wherever it might be that particular census is missing information in a given year. And you can do that for any census. Again, you just type in the year of the census, pull up that particular set of records or that particular database, come over here to the browse box and take a look at what is and is not included in that particular state. Again, it's going to be either because it was not yet a state, in which case you want to make sure that you look in other places, right? What was it before it became the state you know it as, or it's because that particular set of records is missing. So pay attention to that. In conjunction with U.S. Federal Census, there are some state censuses that are also missing. And so pay attention to that. Now, some of you may not even be aware of state censuses. Let me just give you kind of a brief rundown. Not every state does a state census, and not every state that does a census does one on a regular basis. Some just did it once or twice. Some do it fairly consistently. And those that do take a consistent census, typically, but not always, will also do it every 10 years, just like the U.S. Federal Census, but they'll do it on the fives to offset it. And so there are a lot of ways to discover what records are missing, and I didn't pull this up ahead of time because I wanted to kind of show you how I go through this process. I sometimes just want to do a Google search and see what exists. And so I can type in, for example, state census records and see what I can find. In this case, the U.S. Census Bureau has created a list of all states that did a census and what years those censuses exist for. Now, again, they'll remind us that not all censuses have survived, and so if they took a census and it doesn't survive, they're not going to list it. So, for example, you'll see here, Connecticut, no state census records are known to exist. Kentucky, no state census records are known to exist. And they'll note that if a record doesn't exist anymore, okay? But where they do exist, they'll list the years. And some states, you can see, take censuses on a fairly regular basis here. Oregon, for example, took a census in 1842, 1843, 1845. You'll see that a lot in the early years in some places, because part of the purpose of a census for a state was about gaining statehood. And so they would take censuses on a fairly regular basis, submit that to the government as part of their bid for statehood. And then as we get into later years, you start to see here 1865, 1870, 1875, 1885, 1895, 1905. They fall into a little bit more of a consistent pattern, again, every 10 years on the fives by the time it all settles down. And so, again, if you just go Google state census records, one of the first things that's going to come up is going to be the Census Bureau's website, where they have this listing of all the state census records that still are in existence. Not all of them are online. Remember, some of those are still held at the state archives, and you might need to contact them to access those. But if they are held online, again, you can find those at Ancestry. If I just come in here to the card catalog and type in state census, I will get a list of the 49 databases on Ancestry.com that contain state census records. Iowa, Kansas, New York, Florida, Massachusetts, New Jersey. I mean, I could go on. Okay, so just type state census into the card catalog to see a list of what's available online, and visit census.gov to see a list of completely all state censuses in existence. If it's not online, you'll most likely have to contact the state archive in order to get access to that particular set of records. Next up, let's talk about courthouse records. So courthouse records are probably the single, in the United States anyway, the single set of records that are most susceptible to loss. Courthouses over time, particularly during the Civil War, were often targets of the opposition forces, and so courthouses were burned or bombed or destroyed, and by fire most often. Courthouses over time have also been very susceptible to natural disasters, tornadoes, floods, all sorts of weather-related incidents, where the records in a courthouse a courthouse is not designed to be an archive. It's not designed to be, they're a place of business, of conducting the business, usually the legal business of a particular county. However, the kinds of records that are stored in courthouses are invaluable to genealogists, starting with just simply one of the basic foundational records of genealogy, which is a marriage record. Prior to 1900, most states did not keep vital records, birth, marriage, and death records, at a state level. Those records were kept at a county level, and many counties didn't even care so much about births and deaths, but marriages were the record that was kept the earliest, the most frequently, and the most consistently at a county level. And so a lot of these county courthouses contain ledgers full of marriage records, some marriage records that date back to the beginning of the county, whether that county was created in 1897 or whether that county was created in 1787, right? It doesn't matter. They'll have these books and books and books full of marriage records. Some of those county courthouses also have some birth records and some death records as well. More importantly for genealogy, or also important for genealogy, those county courthouses contain land records. Land records identify who owns property, when property is sold, who it's sold to, when property is divided. That becomes critical for genealogy, especially prior to 1850. 1850, of course, being the year when every person in a household was enumerated on the Us Federal Census. Prior to that, you just get a head of household and some tick marks, and you have to do your best to figure out who those tick marks belong to. Now, of course, there is a method to do that, and there is also a video, I believe, by Ancestry Ann, explaining how to do that. But land records become a critical part of that equation. equation when we're trying to determine what's happening to the property in a particular family, or when specific families or individuals are moving into or out of an area. And those land records, in every case, almost universally, are only held at a county level. And so those are valuable records. The third major category of records held by courthouses and critical to family history research are probate records. Probate records are all of the records that are included or necessary in order to probate a person's estate after their death. So probate records include wills, where somebody left a will. If somebody did not leave a will, okay, if they died without a will, that estate still has to be probated, and so you end up with additional records. There are, as part of estate settlements, there are estate inventories. There are people who are assigned as guardians by the court over the underage children to make sure that their interests are handled appropriately. There are people who are assigned as executors of the account or of the estate. And then there is the final estate settlement. And sometimes those estate settlements can take years, but that paperwork that is generated by the legal system in the process of settling those estates, and you'd be surprised, even in the case of small estates, you may think, oh, my ancestor didn't own anything or didn't own property or whatever. But even in the case of some very small estates, there is sometimes mountains of paperwork that is created by the court system. And these particular probate files then are held by these courthouses. And the records, just the detail involved and the relationship information, and sometimes those are the only places where that information exists. Okay, so those are the three major categories of records that are typically held by courthouses: marriage records and some other vital records, land deeds and other land property records, and probate records. Now they do have, depending on the court and the laws of the time and the place, sometimes there are other records, but those are the three major categories of records that most courthouses here in the United States hold. And now, sadly, we have this situation where we have some of those courthouses have been destroyed at various points in time. We use the term, and I've got it here on your screen, burned counties. Okay, burned counties, of course, are those counties where the courthouse has burned down. But there are other ways in which that record loss occurs. So on Family Search, on the Family Search Wiki, they have created an excellent portal for understanding what records still exist at a county level and how to get around some of those missing records. So if you just Google burned counties research, one of the first links that should come up should be the Family Search Wiki, and it will give you information about what counties have suffered record loss. Okay, and I love this tagline they put here on their site. This is not magic. We cannot make missing records reappear, but we can learn to progress without them. So I love that reminder. Just because your particular county where your family lived and where you're needing those records, just because it suffered record loss, doesn't mean all hope is lost. There are some ways around it. And so some of the articles here have some really good reference materials, some really good resources, some really good ideas about ways around those particular records. Okay, you'll see here on this wiki article links to states where there are burned counties, and then from there you'll go to the county level. You'll also see here a list of places with historic record loss, because remember, being a burned county or fire is only one way that records are destroyed in some cases. And so you can then click through to see other places with historic record loss, and here it is done alphabetically by county. So I can come in here for example, to Fairfax County, Virginia, where I have family members, and I can read this entire wiki article about Fairfax County, Virginia, or I can just jump directly to the section about record loss, where it will tell me. Again, this is just one example. Fairfax County was created in 1742. Original wills, marriage registers, and deeds, as well as many other loose papers, were destroyed during the Civil War. Deed books for 26 of the 56 years between 1763 and 1819 are missing. Also, the 1790, 1800, and 1890, obviously, censuses are lost, and the records of some of the parent counties have also been lost. And so it tells me exactly what records, what time periods those records are missing. And that's important to understand because you don't want to spend your time out there looking for records that no longer exist. If you know, for example, that a will that was created in Fairfax County in 1812 no longer exists, then you can spend your time looking for other resources that might answer the same genealogical questions that will could have answered. And that's really important. That's my goal or objective for the time we just spent together today, was to help you understand that there are records that are missing, but there are also ways around some of those records. And maybe we'll talk more about that at a future date, but for now, just know there is a video out there about ways around that missing 1890 federal census. There are some great articles in the Family Search Wiki about ways around some of those burned counties and missing county records, and what records still exist that might help you to discover your family history. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.